Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of a spacious apartment in the heart of Amsterdam. Elizabeth van der Meer, a 27-year-old heiress to one of the richest families in the Netherlands, sat at a massive oak desk, carefully studying the financial statements of the Hope for the Future charity. Her graceful fingers quickly flipped through the pages, and her green eyes reflected growing concern. Elizabeth had grown up in a world of privilege and luxury, but her parents had always emphasized the importance of social responsibility. From an early age, she accompanied them to charity events and visited projects funded by the family foundation. These impressions were deeply rooted in her mind, shaping a person who sought to use her position to make a positive difference in society. After earning a master's degree in economics and finance from the London School of Economics, Elizabeth returned to Amsterdam determined to continue the family tradition of philanthropy. She became actively involved in the management of family philanthropic projects, including the Hope for the Future Foundation, to which the van der Meer family donated millions of euros every year. However, today, April 22, 2023, something in the foundation's report was bothering Elizabeth. She put the papers aside and went to the window, looking out onto the winding canals of Amsterdam. The city went about its business as usual. Tourists on bicycles, locals rushing about on business, leisurely pleasure boats. But Elizabeth's thoughts were far from this idyllic picture. Returning to her desk, she picked up the report again. The numbers didn't add up. Despite the substantial donations, the foundation's actual results seemed disproportionately small. Elizabeth ran a hand through her hair, which was tied up in a neat bun, and took a deep breath. Her analytical mind, honed by years of study and practice, told her that something was wrong. She remembered what her father, Henrik van der Meer, had said to her on the day she graduated from university. "Elizabeth, with great money comes great responsibility. Never take anything for granted, especially when it comes to charity. You have to be sure that every euro goes where it should." The words echoed in her head as she reviewed the report over and over. Suddenly, Elizabeth realized that she couldn't just turn a blind eye to this. She had to know the truth. The decision came suddenly, and it was as bold as it was risky. Elizabeth decided to conduct her own investigation, infiltrating the foundation as an ordinary volunteer. It was dangerous, perhaps even stupid, but she felt it was the only way to get to the bottom of the truth. Elizabeth stood up and walked over to the large mirror in the hallway. She examined her reflection critically. An expensive suit from a famous designer, exquisite jewelry, an impeccable hairstyle. All of it screamed about her status and wealth. If she wanted to conduct this investigation, she would have to completely change her image. Elizabeth spent the next few days preparing for her mission. She created a false identity. Sophie Baker, a 24-year-old university graduate who wanted to devote herself to charity. She bought inexpensive clothes, contact lenses to change the color of her eyes, and temporary hair dye. Practicing in front of the mirror, Elizabeth worked on a new way of speaking and moving, trying to get rid of the habits that betrayed her aristocratic upbringing. She created fake social media profiles for Sophie, filling them with ordinary photos and posts. All the while, thoughts about the possible consequences of her decision haunted her. What if she was discovered? What would her parents think when they found out about her adventure? Would it harm the family's reputation? But whenever doubts began to overcome her, Elizabeth thought about those who were supposed to be helped by the donated money. About children who could be left without an education. About patients who could not receive the necessary treatment. About homeless people who could be left without a roof over their heads. The night before she applied for a job at Hope for the Future, Elizabeth could not sleep for a long time. She lay in her king-size bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what lay ahead. She remembered a conversation with her mother several years ago. Elizabeth, Anna van der Meer had said then, Our family has always strived not only to donate, but to actually change the world for the better. Sometimes that means taking risks, going beyond the norm. But remember, whatever you do, always stay true to your principles and your heart. Those words gave Elizabeth confidence. She knew she was doing the right thing even if her methods were unconventional. On the morning of May 1st, Elizabeth got up early. She put on a simple dress that she had bought in an ordinary store, dyed her hair chestnut brown, and put in contact lenses that turned her green eyes brown. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Standing in front of her was Sophie Baker, an ordinary girl, ready to start working for a charity. As Elizabeth left her apartment, she hesitated for a moment. She could still cancel everything, return to her ordinary life. But then she thought of those she could help by revealing the truth. Taking a deep breath, she headed resolutely to the subway station, ready to begin her investigation. On her way to the Hope for the Future office, Elizabeth, now Sophie, observed the city that seemed so new and unfamiliar to her. She had never traveled on public transport during rush hour before, had not been part of this stream of ordinary people rushing to work. It was exciting and a little scary at the same time. The foundation's office was in an old building in the city center. Elizabeth's heart started pounding as she walked inside. She walked up to the front desk and introduced herself as Sophie Baker, a new volunteer. The girl behind the desk smiled warmly and directed her to the Human Resources Department. The next few hours were a whirlwind of introductions, briefings, and paperwork. Elizabeth played the role of an enthusiastic newcomer, asking questions and appearing genuinely interested in everything that was going on. Inside, she was tense, constantly afraid that someone would recognize her or become suspicious. By the end of the day, Elizabeth, or now Sophie, was officially hired at the Foundation's call center. Her job was to handle calls from potential donors and people in need of help. It was the perfect position to begin an investigation. It gave her access to basic information about the Foundation's financial flows without raising suspicions. Elizabeth returned home that evening, emotionally and physically exhausted. Playing someone else was proving to be much more difficult than she had imagined. After removing her wig and contact lenses, she stood under a hot shower for a long time, trying to wash away the stress of the day. As Elizabeth lay in bed, she thought about her new colleagues. Mark Jansen, the call center manager, seemed friendly and helpful, but something about his demeanor made her wary. Ingrid Peters, the accountant, was reserved and taciturn, but her keen gaze seemed to notice everything around her. And then there was Lucas Vermeer, a young IT specialist who spent most of his time at his computer but occasionally cast interested glances at her. Elizabeth knew she had a long way to go. She had to win the trust of her colleagues, gain access to more detailed financial information, and still not give herself away. It was a spy game she was not prepared for, but there was no turning back now. As Elizabeth drifted off to sleep, she thought about the people the Foundation was supposed to help, about the children in developing countries who, thanks to Hope for the Future, were able to get an education, about the medical programs that saved lives, about the environmental projects. All this gave her strength and confidence in the correctness of her decision. She knew that difficulties and dangers awaited her ahead, but she also knew that she would not stop until she got to the truth. Elizabeth Vandermeer, hiding behind the mask of Sophie Baker, was ready to begin the most important investigation of her life. An investigation that could change the fates of many people and perhaps the entire charity system in the country. With these thoughts, Elizabeth fell into a restless sleep, unaware of how difficult and dangerous her path to the truth would be. 3 weeks had passed since Elizabeth Vandermeer, hiding under the guise of Sophie Baker, began working at the charity foundation Hope of the Future. During this time, she had managed to get used to the role of an ordinary call center employee, and began to gradually collect information about the internal processes of the organization. The morning of May 22nd began for Elizabeth as usual, with a cup of coffee in the small kitchen of the office. She tried to arrive early so that she could discreetly study documents and eavesdrop on the conversations of her colleagues. "Good morning, Sophie." The cheerful voice of Mark Jansen, the call center manager, rang out. "How are you working here? Have you settled in yet?" Elizabeth smiled tightly. "Good morning, Mark. Yes, thank you. Everything is fine. The work is very interesting." Mark came closer and lowered his voice. "Listen, I have a special assignment for you. There are some large donations that need to be processed. It's confidential information, so be careful." Elizabeth felt her pulse quicken. This could be the lead she was looking for. "Sure, Mark. I'll be very careful." Elizabeth spent the day working through the documents Mark had given her. She carefully analyzed each transaction, comparing amounts and dates. By evening, a disturbing picture was forming. Back home, Elizabeth sat down at her laptop and opened the encrypted file where she had been keeping notes on the investigation. She began entering new data when she noticed a strange pattern. Some large donations seemed to disappear before reaching their final recipients. "It can't be," Elizabeth whispered, feeling a chill run down her spine. She spent several more hours rechecking her findings, but the result remained the same. A significant portion of the funds were disappearing somewhere along the way from donors to beneficiaries. Elizabeth spent the next few days in a state of constant tension. She continued to perform her duties at the call center while simultaneously trying to find additional evidence to support her suspicions. On June 16th, an event occurred that further strengthened her belief that something was wrong at the foundation. Elizabeth was staying late at the office, working on a report. Suddenly, she heard muffled voices coming from the office of Ingrid Peters, the chief accountant. As Elizabeth approached the door cautiously, she could hear fragments of conversation between Ingrid and Mark. "We need to be careful with this special project," Ingrid was saying. "If anyone starts digging too deep—" "Don't worry," Mark replied. "It's all under control. The main thing is to keep the new kids away from—" At that moment, a floorboard creaked in the hallway and the conversation ended abruptly. Elizabeth barely had time to back away from the door and pretend to be passing by when Mark poked his head out of his office. "Sophie, you're still here?" he asked, surprised. "Yeah, I was just finishing up a report," Elizabeth replied, trying to sound as casual as possible. "I see. Well, don't stay up too late," Mark said, looking at her intently. Elizabeth nodded and hurried to her desk, her heart pounding. She was sure that Mark and Ingrid were hiding something, and that it had something to do with the missing donations. The next day, Elizabeth decided to take a chance and try to gain access to more detailed financial information. She approached Lucas Vermeer, a young IT specialist with whom she had developed a fairly friendly relationship. "Lucas, hi," she began, trying to sound casual. "Listen, I have some questions about the donor database. Can you help me out?" Lucas looked up from his computer and smiled. "Sure, Sophie. What exactly are you interested in?" Elizabeth began asking questions, gradually guiding the conversation toward financial transactions. Lucas answered readily, but when the conversation turned to the movement of large sums, he suddenly became less talkative. "You know, Sophie," he said, lowering his voice, "some things are better left unexamined, for your own good." Elizabeth felt a shudder run through her body. Was Lucas up to something bad too, or was he just trying to warn her? That evening, Elizabeth decided to take a risky step. She waited until everyone had left the office and then entered the office of the foundation's director, Hendrik van Luna. Elizabeth's heart was pounding so hard that it seemed like it could be heard in the quiet of the empty office. She turned on the director's computer and, using the skills she had learned during her studies, tried to access the protected files. After a few minutes of intense work, she managed to hack the security system, Folders with mysterious names appeared on the screen. One of them caught her attention: Project Lotus. Elizabeth opened the folder and found many encrypted documents. She quickly copied them to her flash drive, realizing that she did not have time to decrypt them right now. Suddenly, she heard the sound of the front door of the office opening. Someone was back. In a panic, Elizabeth turned off her computer, grabbed her bag, and hid behind a large cabinet in the corner of her office. Moments later, the door to her office opened and Mark Jansen walked in. He walked up to the director's desk and began searching through the drawers. Elizabeth held her breath, afraid to move. Finally, Mark apparently found what he was looking for and left the office. Elizabeth waited a few more minutes before carefully emerging from her hiding place. She slipped quietly out of the office, adrenaline coursing through her veins. Elizabeth spent the next few days trying to decipher the documents in the Project Lotus folder. It was more difficult than she expected, but her financial education and natural savvy helped her make steady progress. On June 22nd, an event occurred that further increased her suspicions. During her lunch break, Elizabeth overheard a conversation between Ingrid and one of the project managers. "We need to increase the percentage of administrative expenses for the project in Africa," Ingrid was saying. "Let's say that transportation costs have increased." "But that's not true," the manager objected. "We've already cut the budget for school construction." "Don't ask any questions," Ingrid snapped. "Just do as I say." Elizabeth felt anger rising inside her. She was beginning to understand the scale of what was happening. This was not just a small embezzlement. It seemed that there was a whole system of misappropriation of donations at the foundation. That evening, sitting in her apartment, Elizabeth thought long and hard about what to do next. She had already collected enough evidence to at least initiate an official investigation. But what if that was not enough? What if the organizers of the scam managed to cover their tracks? Elizabeth knew she needed an ally within the organization, someone she could trust and who could help her gather even more evidence. Her thoughts returned to Lucas Vermeer. The next day, Elizabeth decided to take a chance and talk to Lucas. She invited him to lunch at a small cafe near the office. "Lucas," she began as they sat down at a table, "I have something to confess to you." Lucas looked at her carefully. "I'm listening, Sophie." Elizabeth took a deep breath. "My name is not really Sophie. I'm Elizabeth Vandermeer, and I'm here to investigate financial fraud at the fund." Lucas was silent for what seemed like an eternity to Elizabeth. Then he said quietly, "I knew there was something wrong with you. You're too smart to be a call center employee." Aren't you surprised?" Elizabeth asked. Lucas smiled bitterly. "I'm not who I say I am either. I work for financial intelligence. We've long suspected that something was fishy at the fund, but we couldn't find enough evidence." Elizabeth felt her head spin at the revelation. "So, we're on the same side." "It looks like it." Lucas nodded. "But we have to be very careful now. If Mark or Ingrid suspect anything, we could be in danger." Elizabeth and Lucas worked together for the next few days, carefully collecting and analyzing information. With the help of Lucas's technical skills, they managed to decipher most of the documents in the Lotus Project folder. What they discovered shocked them both. It turned out that the foundation's management had created a complex money laundering scheme, using charitable projects as a cover. Millions of euros intended for helping the needy were ending up in offshore accounts. "We have to stop this," Elizabeth said, looking at the computer screen where the financial flowcharts were displayed. Lucas nodded. "Yes, but we need more evidence. We need to catch them red-handed." They decided to continue their investigation for another week to gather as much information as possible. Every day was filled with tension and fear of exposure. On June 30th, an event occurred that accelerated the denouement. Elizabeth accidentally overheard a phone conversation with Mark. from which it became clear that the foundation's management was planning a major withdrawal operation for the following week. "Lucas, we don't have any more time," Elizabeth said as soon as she found a moment to talk to him alone. "They are planning a major operation for next week. We have to act now." Lucas frowned. "It's risky. We might spook them and lose all the evidence. But if we don't stop them now, they'll have time to cover their tracks," Elizabeth insisted. "I have an idea." Elizabeth's plan was bold and dangerous. She proposed using her status as the heir of the van der Meer family to stage a surprise raid on the foundation. It would catch the criminals off guard and not give them time to destroy the evidence. "Are you sure?" Lucas asked. "It could put you in danger." Elizabeth nodded. "I'm willing to take the risk. There's too much at stake." The next 2 days passed in a feverish rush. Elizabeth and Lucas meticulously prepared for the operation, collecting all available evidence and coordinating their actions with financial intelligence. On the morning of July 3rd, Elizabeth van der Meer, no longer hiding her true identity, walked into the offices of the Hope for the Future Foundation, accompanied by a group of auditors and law enforcement officers. "Gentlemen, I am Elizabeth van der Meer," she announced as she entered the conference room where the foundation's management had gathered. "And I am here to conduct a full audit of the foundation's activities." Mark Jansen turned pale. Ingrid Peters tried to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. The foundation's director, Hendrik van Loon, looked as if he had seen a ghost. "There must be some mistake," he finally managed. "Our paperwork is all in order." "Then you won't mind a detailed check," Elizabeth replied calmly, "including Project Lotus." At the mention of Lotus, Hendrik van Loon slumped into his chair as if all the air had been let out. How did you know?" At that moment, Lucas walked into the room. "I think it's time to tell the whole truth," he said, showing his financial intelligence officer credentials. The next few hours were a chaos of checks, interrogations, and arrests. Elizabeth watched the criminal scheme she had exposed unravel. She felt a mixture of triumph and bitterness at the way these people had betrayed the trust of those they were supposed to be helping. By evening, the main suspects had been arrested, and a team of investigators were at work in the fund's office, going through every document and computer file. Elizabeth was standing by the window, looking out over the city when Lucas approached her. "You did it," he said with a smile. "You exposed one of the biggest scams in the history of charity." Elizabeth smiled weakly back. "We did it together. But this is just the beginning. Now we need to restore the foundation's reputation and make sure that the help actually gets to those who need it." Lucas nodded. "And I'm sure you can handle it as well as you did the investigation." Elizabeth turned to him. "Will you stay and help?" "Of course," Lucas replied. "Someone has to make sure you don't get involved in another dangerous adventure." They both laughed, feeling the tension of the past weeks easing. There was a lot of work ahead of them, but now they could afford a moment of triumph. Elizabeth returned to her apartment that evening. She felt exhausted but satisfied. Turning on the television, she saw breaking news about a major financial fraud at a charity being exposed. Sitting on the couch, watching the story she had helped uncover unfold, Elizabeth thought about the future. She knew her life would never be the same. The experience of this investigation had changed her, shown her what she was capable of. Elizabeth pulled out her phone and dialed her father. "Dad," she said when he answered, "I have an idea about how we can change the world for the better, and I'm going to need your help." 3 months had passed since the financial fraud at the Hope for the Future Foundation was exposed. Elizabeth van der Meer threw herself into reorganizing the foundation, seeking to restore its reputation and ensure transparency in all its operations. Lucas Vermeer remained with her as head of internal audit. It was a cool October evening. Elizabeth was lingering in her office, reviewing reports on new charitable projects. Suddenly, a strange noise in the hallway caught her attention. Peeking out of her office, she saw a dark figure quickly disappearing around the corner. "Hey!" Elizabeth shouted, giving chase. But the hallway was empty. Returning to her office, she was horrified to find that her computer had been hacked, and a message flashed on the screen. "Not all secrets are out, Miss Vandermeer. Dig deeper." Elizabeth immediately contacted Lucas. "We need to meet." "Now," she said, feeling the adrenaline begin to pulse through her veins again. Half an hour later, they were sitting in a small cafe not far from the office. Elizabeth explained what had happened, and Lucas listened carefully, his frown deepening with each word. "This is serious, Elizabeth," he said finally. "It looks like we've only uncovered the tip of the iceberg. Someone clearly wants us to continue the investigation." "But who? And why now?" Elizabeth shook her head. "We've caught all the prime suspects." Lucas tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the table. "Maybe not all of them. Remember those encrypted files we were never able to fully decipher? Maybe there's a clue there." Elizabeth nodded. "You're right. We should go back to them, but we have to tread carefully. If someone is watching us, we can't trust anyone but each other." Elizabeth and Lucas spent the next few days poring over old files and documents. They worked through the night, trying to remain inconspicuous. On the third night, their efforts finally paid off. "Elizabeth, look at this," Lucas called, pointing to his laptop screen. "I found a strange pattern in the financial transactions. Some of the funds were regularly transferred to an account called Aurora Investments." Elizabeth leaned closer, studying the data. "I've never heard of this company. It didn't figure into our investigation." "Exactly," Lucas nodded. "And what's interesting is that this company was founded just a month before your father became the main donor to Hope for the Future." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. "Do you think my father might be involved in this?" Lucas held up his hands. "I'm not confirming anything, but it's an odd coincidence that we can't ignore." Elizabeth sat back in her chair, feeling the world shift beneath her. The idea that her father might be involved in financial fraud was unbelievable, but she couldn't deny the facts. "We need to check out this company," she said finally. "But how do we do it without attracting attention?" Lucas thought for a moment. "I have a friend in the IRS. He might be able to look into Aurora Investments off the record." Elizabeth nodded. "Okay, but be careful. We don't know how deep this might go." A week of tense anticipation passed. Elizabeth tried to act as normal, continuing her work at the fund, but thoughts of her father's possible involvement were nagging at her. Finally, Lucas contacted her. "I have information," he said when he met Elizabeth in the park. "And you're not going to like it. Aurora Investments is a shell company. Its real owner is a holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. And guess who's on the board of that holding company?" Elizabeth felt her breath catch in her throat. "Don't tell me." "Your father," Lucas finished. "Henrik Vandermeer is listed as one of the directors." Elizabeth sank onto the bench, feeling the world crumble around her. "This can't be true. My father couldn't have been involved in this." Lucas sat down next to her. "Elizabeth, I know this is hard, but we can't ignore the facts. We need to dig further." Elizabeth shook her head. "I need to talk to him. Maybe there's an explanation." "It's risky," Lucas warned. "If he's really involved, you might scare him off." "He's my father, Lucas," Elizabeth said firmly. "I have to give him a chance to explain himself." The next day, Elizabeth came to her father's office. Henrik Vandermeer looked surprised and pleased to see her. "Elizabeth, what a pleasant surprise. How is the fund going?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. "Daddy, we need to talk. It's about Aurora Investments." Henrik's face changed. For a moment, fear flashed in his eyes, but he quickly pulled himself together. "I don't know what you're talking about, dear." "Please don't lie to me," Elizabeth said, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. "I know about your involvement in the Cayman Islands holding company." "What's going on, Dad? Were you, were you involved in the fun shenanigans? Henrik was silent for a long time, looking out the window. When he finally spoke, his voice was tired. You don't understand, Elizabeth. It's more complicated than it looks. Then explain it to me, Elizabeth cried. I deserve to know the truth. Henrik sighed. Okay, but not here. Meet me tonight at our old summer house. I'll tell you everything. Elizabeth nodded and left the office, feeling drained. She immediately contacted Lucas and told him about her conversation with her father. I don't like this, Lucas said. It could be a trap. I have to go, Elizabeth replied. But you're right, we have to be careful. I'll take a voice recorder with me and turn on the geolocation feature on my phone. If you don't hear from me within 2 hours of the meeting, call the police. That evening, Elizabeth arrived at the Vandermeer family's old summer house. The mansion, located on the shore of a lake, looked abandoned and gloomy in the gathering dusk. Elizabeth walked into the house and found her father in the living room. He was sitting in an old armchair, looking at the extinguished fireplace. I'm glad you came, he said without turning around. Sit down. This is going to be a long conversation. Elizabeth sat down opposite her father, her heart pounding. It all started 20 years ago, Henrik began. I was a young, ambitious businessman, ready to do anything to succeed. One day, some people approached me with a deal they couldn't refuse. They represented the interests of very influential people who needed a way to, shall we say, optimize their finances. Elizabeth listened with bated breath as her father told the story of how he had created a complex network of companies and foundations designed to launder money and evade taxes. The hope of the future was just part of the scheme. I know what you're thinking, Elizabeth, Henrik said, noticing the look on her face. But you have to understand, I couldn't refuse. These people, they're not people to trifle with. When I tried to get out of the business 5 years ago, they threatened you and your mother. Elizabeth felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. Why didn't you call the police? Henrik smiled bitterly. The police? Elizabeth, these people control the police. They control everything. I was trapped, and all I could do was play by their rules, hoping to protect my family. And that's why you let me investigate? Elizabeth asked, suddenly realizing. You knew what I'd find? Henrik nodded. I hoped you could do what I couldn't, break this cycle, but I didn't expect you to go this far. Elizabeth felt herself overcome with conflicting emotions, anger, disappointment, pity for her father. What do we do now? I have a plan, Henrik said, but it's dangerous, and you'll have to trust me. At that moment, there was the sound of breaking glass, and a smoke bomb flew into the room. Elizabeth heard screams and the sounds of a struggle before passing out from the acrid smoke. When she came to, she found herself in a hospital room. Lucas was sitting next to the bed, looking worried. What happened? Elizabeth asked, trying to sit up. You were attacked, Lucas replied. When you didn't respond, I called the police. We found you unconscious in the house, but your father wasn't there. Elizabeth felt panic rise within her. We have to find him. He's in danger. Lucas shook his head. Elizabeth, there's something else you need to know. We found documents in your father's office. It looks like he was planning on disappearing. Tickets, new passports, everything is ready. Elizabeth sank back into her pillow, feeling the world crumble around her. Had her father deceived her again? Or was this part of the plan he had talked about? What do we do now? She asked quietly. A week had passed since Henrik von der Meer's disappearance. Elizabeth, now out of the hospital, had plunged into a frantic search for her father and the mysteries surrounding his activities. Lucas was by her side, helping her navigate the maze of financial documents and corporate connections. On the 8th day of their investigation, a breakthrough came. Lucas had discovered an encrypted message hidden in one of Aurora Investments' old files. After hours of work, they were able to decipher its contents. "Elizabeth, look," Lucas called, pointing to the computer screen. "These are coordinates and a date, and the date is tomorrow." Elizabeth leaned over the screen, feeling her pulse quicken. "This must be from Father. He left us a clue." The coordinates pointed to an abandoned industrial complex on the outskirts of Amsterdam. Elizabeth and Lucas decided to go there, but first they informed reliable law enforcement officers with whom Lucas had worked in the past. The next day, as they approached the designated location, their hearts were beating faster than ever. The abandoned complex looked ominous in the setting sun. Suddenly, a man walked around the corner of one of the buildings. It was Henrik van der Meer. "Dad!" Elizabeth exclaimed, rushing towards him. Henrik hugged his daughter, then nodded to Lucas. "I'm glad you were able to decipher the message. We don't have much time." He led them inside the building, where they found a makeshift command center with several computers and stacks of documents. "Listen carefully," Henrik began. "Over the past 20 years, I have collected irrefutable evidence of an international criminal organization behind all these financial scams. They control politicians, judges, police officials in several countries." Elizabeth and Lucas listened with bated breath as Henrik revealed the scale of the conspiracy. It turned out that hope of the future was just the tip of the iceberg in a complex network of money laundering and corruption. "I couldn't take the risk before," Henrik continued, "but now, thanks to your investigation, we have a chance to bring down the entire system." At that moment, the sound of approaching cars was heard outside. "It must be reinforcements," Lucas said, looking out the window, but Henrik shook his head. "No, it's them. They've found us. Quickly, take those flash drives and the documents. All the evidence is here. You must leave them in safe hands." "What about you?" Elizabeth asked, feeling panic creeping up on her. Henrik smiled a sad smile. "I'll hold them off. This is my chance to redeem myself." "No, Dad, we won't leave you," Elizabeth cried. But Henrik was adamant. "Elizabeth, listen to me. You have to finish what we started. These people have to be stopped. Promise me you'll do it." With tears in her eyes, Elizabeth nodded. Lucas pulled her hand. "We have to go. Now!" They ran out the back door just as the front door was kicked down. Elizabeth heard her father's voice distracting their pursuers, and that was the last time she heard it. The next few days passed in a blur. Elizabeth and Lucas worked non-stop, analyzing the evidence they had gathered and coordinating with international law enforcement agencies. The information Henrik had gathered turned out to be a ticking time bomb that shook the foundations of the financial and political worlds. Mass arrests began, the accounts of major corporations were frozen, and a number of high-ranking politicians were exposed. The world seemed to be turned upside down. A month after the events at the industrial complex, Elizabeth stood in front of a mirror preparing for a press conference. She was to make a statement about the reorganization of the Hope for the Future Foundation and new measures to ensure transparency in the charitable sector. Lucas approached her and put his hand on her shoulder. "Are you ready?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. "Yes. It's time to tell the world the truth and start over." As they walked out to the press, the flashes of cameras momentarily blinded Elizabeth. But then she saw the faces of the people, tired but full of hope. She realized that her fight was just beginning, the fight for justice, transparency, and real charity. Elizabeth walked to the microphone and began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, today I want to tell you a story of betrayal and redemption, of darkness and light. But most of all, it's a story of hope. The hope that together we can change the world for the better." The bright June sun flooded a spacious conference room in The Hague. Elizabeth van der Meer, now a leading figure in international philanthropy and the fight against corruption, stood behind the podium, addressing delegates from around the world. 5 years ago, We began the journey toward transparency and accountability in philanthropy, she said, her voice confident and passionate. Today, I am proud to say that we have made significant progress, but our work is not finished. Later, Elizabeth looked out the window at the busy street. People were rushing about their business, unaware of the battles being fought behind the scenes for their well-being.